everybody, welcome to VFX Together. My name is Matt. Let's go ahead and jump into our very first tutorial. Let's take a look at what we're going to be making today. Okay, so yes, it is the classic Star Wars opening title crawl. I figured I'd start with this, not just because the new movie's coming up in a few months, but also because if you're anything like me, your interest in making visual effects was either begun with Star Wars or heavily influenced by it, and I just think it's a fun movie and a great example of how to use visual effects in a film. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is create this fading in right here. So let's go ahead and make a new comp. We'll call this a long time ago. And we're just going to make it about 175 frames. So let's go ahead and create some text. And set our color first. So it's just simple cyan. We're going to do 256 on green, 256 on blue, and nothing on red. And we should get a pretty good representation here. So we're going to go ahead and make that left hand justified, scale it down, and go over to our line tool and center everything. And there we go. So that's pretty simple. We're just going to do a quick fade using keyframes on opacity. We're going to start out at 0, go maybe a second in, go up to 100%, go all the way to the end, go back down to 0, go a second back, and put that up at 100%. So now we get something like this. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and create a main composition. Let's call this main. I'm going to set this to about 1500 frames. And we will drop our text composition right in there. So there we go. There's our first part. Very simple. If you're wondering about the font, it is Franklin Gothic. That's the font that was used in the prequel movies. The original movies actually didn't use a digital font at all. It was way before computer titling came along, so it's going to be kind of difficult to match anything perfect on that. But this works pretty well for our purposes, and we're just going to let that go. So let's go ahead and create another composition, and this will be our crawl. So we're going to make this one, we'll go a little bit over just because in case we want to play with the timing or anything. So we'll make that 2000 frames. So the first thing we're going to do is create our logo that begins and then kind of scales or fades away into the distance. So we're just going to create some new text. And for this, I'm using a font that is free on the internet. It's been around forever. It's called Star Jedi. It was made by some fans, I think originally on the Force.net forums, but may even predate that. I'm not sure. But it's a great font, works really well, and nobody's seen need to create anything bigger or anything newer. So I guess it's considered the standard still. So I'm just going to kind of scale everything up. And we're going to go ahead and center that in the frame. So you might think that the easiest thing to do to animate this is just going to be to put it in the middle and scale it down. But if I scale it up and center this in the frame, you'll notice when I play with the scaling, what's happening is it's not scaling perfectly to the middle. And that is not really going to be what we need. Now, one thing we could obviously do is mess with the anchor point. We can center that, we can move this back to the middle, and then when we scale it, then everything lines up and it's all good. But the problem is, let's say we wanted to come back in here and change some text, right? Let's, instead of VFX, what if we wanted to actually put visual effects? So we make our change, scroll everything down, and oops, now the anchor point, because we changed the text, the anchor point is not in the middle. So that's not really going to work very well if you want to make sure that you can update this later. So what I prefer to do is, once I've got everything kind of where I want it for the beginning, I'm going to Control-Shift-C, Command-Shift-C on the Mac, and pre-comp this. So we're just going to call this the title. We're going to pre-comp it, move everything, and then if we go back now, because it's a pre-comp, everything is centered. But if I go in here, and I want to change this, let's say we do that, scale this down. Now all I have to do is center this, and if I go back to the crawl, no matter what I do to the text, that anchor point is still in the middle. So if I have this whole thing animated, then no matter what I do inside that title comp, it's still going to animate properly later. So let's say we want to keep that. And so first thing we're going to do, we want to make sure that this actually looks like the original title. So in the original, it's filled with black, and we're going to take our stroke color and just make that a nice kind of gold. There we go, that looks pretty good. And you can play with the size of the stroke on each of these until you get something that you like. So I like that right there, so we're going to keep that. Let's jump back out here, put a scale here, set a keyframe, go, maybe, I don't know, maybe another 200 frames. We'll scale this down to 0. And now we've got a nice logo that fades out. Now, also want to put a little bit of a fade here at the end. So we'll just bring up our scale keyframes, press U on the keyboard to bring up all the keyframes, so that way we can see where our scale ends, and bring that down to opacity of 0. So now we got a nice smooth fade into the background, and right before it fades completely out. Okay, so that's where we want to end that. So I'm going to press Alt right bracket, and that's going to cut that comp off right where we want it there. I'm going to jump forward a few frames, and then we're going to create a new composition, and we're going to call this text. Now for this one, I'm actually going to make it pretty tall. You'll see why in just a minute. We're going to keep the duration, that's fine. So now we've got just kind of this nice tall block, and we're going to create the title. Now you might think we need to create the title in kind of a weird perspective view or something like that, but the way I'm going to do it is going to be a lot easier. We're going to be able to create it completely flat, and then we can mess with the perspective in 3D later. So I'm just going to click and drag a box. Now the reason I'm clicking and dragging instead of just clicking in the center is because we need these paragraph controls down here to make sure our text all lines up with each other. And if you don't create a box, if you just click a text point and start typing, these will be grayed out. So that's very important for title work and things like that. So we're going to start out and just type episode 1 and switch back to our Franklin Gothic. And in this case, I'm going to use Franklin Demi Condensed. We're going to switch this, we're going to swap out that, and then click back on our stroke and remove the stroke. That's pretty good, and then we're going to just center that. So we'll zoom in here and take a look. So that looks pretty good. We'll put our title, let's call it opening title crawl. So in this case, what you're going to want to do is just kind of play around with the size of the text itself, the spacing between lines. In this case, we want to stretch these out a little bit like the original. If you look at some of the reference photos and things online, it's pretty easy to tell what they kind of did there. And then go into full justification. Okay, so now we're ready to type our paragraph. So if you notice what I said in the first paragraph, each block of text is basically 1 or 2 sentences. And this is only if you want to keep with the format of the movies. If you're making your own thing, it doesn't really matter. So we just want to make sure that these are all justified and set up in the right size and everything that we want. So we'll say, this is the next sentence. Something about rebels and the evil empire. This is the last sentence. Who will save us all? Question mark. Or let's just do ... Okay, so now we've got, whatever we want to have for our title crawl. Now if we go back to our title, or if we go back to our crawl, then we can bring this text in. Now, you might think that this is a problem because this obviously is not what we want, but that's one of the great features of After Effects is that we can work in 3D. Now, one simple way to do this is just to rotate along the appropriate axis. We bring it down and all, yada, 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 and this looks really good. Now, the problem, though, is when we start trying to make it animate, we're gonna run into problems because it's not going to move along its local axis. It's going to move along the camera axis. You can actually try and zoom in here, and we can look at it. We can manually adjust it along here, but we're not going to be able to get a local value down here in the text, which is going to make it just kind of a lot more difficult to adjust. So you'll notice as I'm dragging this up and down along its local axis, the text down here is affecting both the Y and the Z coordinates, which means that if we ever want to change something on this, make small adjustments, it's going to be much more difficult. So that's not really what we want to do. So I'm going to set the orientation on this back to 0. And what I'm going to do is actually create a camera. And now what we can do is we can rotate the camera itself to be in the right perspective. But see, now notice what we can do. If we move the camera kind of where it needs to be, if we move it forward and backward on the y-axis, the camera is actually moving along the world. Even though it's rotated, it's just moving forward and backwards. So we can actually get a very smooth rotation or a very smooth translation back along the crawl and keep the perspective that we're looking for. So that's pretty good. We're going to go ahead and just start out there. And we will set our position keyframe, come here to about 1200. We're going to set position keyframe where it's far away. And we're going to go back to our text, and we'll set some opacity keyframes to kind of fade this out. So not bad, but if I'm looking here, it seems like this title crawl, we're a little bit flat. We're a little bit too horizontal looking at this. But the cool thing is, all I have to do is come in here and adjust the orientation on the camera. Now, if we do want to adjust kind of where the camera sits in the world, we can select all of the keyframes for position, go to one of those keyframes, and now we can adjust some of this stuff without changing the relative difference between those two keyframes. So in this case, it's pretty good. I'm going to flatten it out just a little bit more. Back to position. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we'll go back into our main comp. And we will drag our crawl composition in here. And see what we've got. Okay, so that's pretty good. Everything looks pretty good. We've got some good speed on the logo. We've got good angle and everything and perspective on the title crawl. Now, we're still missing something, though. We are missing a star field in the background. Now, obviously, the easiest way to do this would be to just go find an image online and drag that in, but we don't actually have to. So the first thing we're going to do is create a solid. We're just going to call this star field. And we're going to stick that underneath everything. And we are just going to go into generate. We're going to go into noise and grain, fractal noise. We're going to change the fractal type to small bumps. We're going to change the noise type to linear. And we are going to go into the transform options and change the scale all the way down to 1. And a contrast all the way up. And now, if I zoom in here, boom, we've got a star field. And then you can play with the settings on this. We can kind of play with the evolution until we get something that looks a little bit more random. We can up the scale a little bit. Maybe you don't want so many stars. Maybe you want something more like that. But there you go. And this is completely procedural. You can kind of play around however you want it until you get something that you like. And there it is. So the last thing is to put some music to it. And obviously, if you're doing this as a fan film or as just an obvious parody or homage to the original, you want to use the original music. But if you're making something on YouTube or somewhere else where you really need to keep it copyright free, the opening music that I used in my example video is actually free online. You can find it at bricktrick.de, and I'll put a link down in the description. Drag it down into your timeline, and we have And that's it. So hopefully you've seen how super easy it is to create a Star Wars style opening crawl using nothing but After Effects. If you like the video, please subscribe to this channel and be sure to check out other tutorials as I get them posted. So we'll see you guys later.